Since February 2022, this sound has become part of daily life for millions of people in Ukraine. What began as a ground invasion has evolved into one of the most technologically intense wars fought in Europe since World War II. A war defined not just by soldiers and tanks, but by missiles, drones, and long-range strike systems hitting cities hundreds of kilometers from the front line. In this video, we're going to break down the conflict itself and then go deep into the actual weapon systems Russia has used to strike Ukraine, from cruise missiles to hypersonic weapons to swarms of exploding drones, and what effect they've had on the war. To understand the weapons, you first need to understand the war. On February 24, 2022, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, crossing the border from the north, east, and south simultaneously. Russian President Vladimir Putin framed the invasion as a special military operation, claiming it was meant to protect Russian-speaking populations in eastern Ukraine and prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Ukraine and most of the international community rejected that framing entirely, calling it an unprovoked war of aggression and a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. The early phase of the war saw Russian troops push toward the capital, Kyiv, attempting a rapid takeover. That attempt failed. Ukrainian forces, backed by Western intelligence and weapon shipments, pushed Russian troops back from the north within the first 2 months. From there, the war shifted. Russia consolidated control over parts of the Donbas region in the east and Crimea in the south, territory it had partially occupied since 2014, while grinding trench-style warfare set in along a front line stretching over 1,000 kilometers. But even as the ground war slowed into a war of attrition, a second war was happening in parallel, a war fought with long-range weapons, aimed not just at the battlefield, but at Ukraine's cities, power grid, and civilian infrastructure. That's the part of this war we're going to focus on now. Russia has relied on a mix of missile systems to strike targets deep inside Ukraine, often far from the front line. Let's go through the main ones. Iskander missiles. The 9K720 Iskander is a short-range ballistic missile system, one of the most frequently used Russian weapons in this war. It travels fast, follows a semi-ballistic trajectory, and can be difficult for older air defense systems to intercept. Russia has used Iskanders repeatedly against Ukrainian cities and military infrastructure throughout the conflict. Kalibr cruise missiles. The 3M54 Kalibr is a sea-launched cruise missile fired from Russian ships and submarines in the Black Sea. Unlike ballistic missiles, cruise missiles fly closer to the ground and can maneuver, which makes them harder to track on radar, though generally slower and more intercept-able than ballistic weapons. Kh-101 and Kh-555, air-launched cruise missiles. These are launched from long-range Russian bombers, often flying from deep inside Russian airspace. According to Ukrainian officials, Russia has continued producing updated versions of the Kh-101 well into 2026, meaning the missile threat hasn't just continued, it's evolved. 4. Kh-22 and Kh-32. Missiles originally designed during the Soviet era as anti-ship weapons, these missiles have been repurposed for strikes on land targets. They're notoriously imprecise, which is part of why their use against populated areas has drawn international criticism. They were never designed for pinpoint accuracy against ground targets. 5. The Kinzhal, Russia's hypersonic weapon. The Kh-47M2 Kinzhal, meaning dagger, is an air-launched ballistic missile that Russia has marketed as hypersonic, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 10. It's launched from MiG-31 fighter jets and has been used against high-value targets, including attempts to strike air defense systems protecting Kyiv. 6. The Oreshnik. In late 2024, Russia used a new intermediate-range ballistic missile called Oreshnik for the first time in combat, striking the city of Dnipro. Analysts widely view the Oreshnik as a dual-capable weapon, meaning it's designed to be able to carry either conventional or nuclear warheads, and its use has been interpreted as much as a message to the West as a military strike on Ukraine itself. 7. Zircon missiles. More recently, Ukrainian officials have reported the use of Zircon missiles, large anti-ship cruise missiles. Russia has adapted for strikes on land targets, including cities like Kyiv and Bila Tserkva. Narrator VO. What's notable is the sheer scale of these strikes. Reports from mid-2026 describe overnight barrages combining dozens of missiles with hundreds of drones in a single wave, a deliberate strategy to overwhelm Ukraine's air defense network by throwing more targets at it than it can possibly intercept. Visual, footage-animation of triangular delta-wing drones. Narrator VO. If missiles are the sharp edge of Russia's strike campaign, drones are the volume behind it. The centerpiece of this is the Shahed drone, originally designed in Iran and now license-produced inside Russia itself under a domestic name, German. These are what's known as loitering munitions, or exploding drones. They're relatively cheap, slow, and fly low, but Russia has used them in overwhelming numbers, sometimes launching hundreds in a single night. The strategy isn't precision, it's saturation, forcing Ukraine to spend expensive interceptor missiles on cheap drones, wearing down air defense stockpiles over time. On-screen text, Shahed/German drones, cheap, mass-produced, deployed by the hundreds. Narrator VO. Alongside these long-range attack drones, both sides have made extensive use of smaller first-person view drones, FPV drones, on the battlefield itself. These are typically modified commercial quadcopters fitted with small explosive charges, flown directly into vehicles, fortified positions, or even individual soldiers. This kind of drone warfare has become so central to the front line that some military analysts now describe it as the defining feature of this war, a level of persistent aerial surveillance and precision strike capability that simply didn't exist in earlier 20th century wars. By mid-2026, reporting indicates Russia has been combining massive drone raids, sometimes exceeding 500 to 600 drones in a single wave, with dozens of missiles fired in the same attack, specifically targeting Kyiv and other major cities. Narrator VO. A defining feature of this war has been Russia's sustained campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Since the autumn of 2022, Russian forces have repeatedly targeted power plants, substations, and heating infrastructure, particularly ahead of and during the winter months. The goal, according to Ukrainian officials and independent monitors, has been to break down the country's electrical grid, cutting power and heat to millions of civilians during the coldest part of the year. Attacks in cities like Kyiv have left hundreds of thousands of households without electricity or water for extended periods. This strategy has drawn sustained condemnation from international human rights organizations, who argue that deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure, rather than purely military targets, raises serious questions under the laws of war. Narrator VO. Beyond missiles and drones, there have been repeated, documented allegations of chemical weapons used by Russian forces during the war, a serious violation of the International Chemical Weapons Convention. Reports, including assessments from Dutch intelligence services, point to the use of riot control and caustic agents on the battlefield, deployed via grenades and drone-dropped munitions. While these are generally not the kind of large-scale chemical weapons associated with 20th century warfare, their repeated battlefield use has been flagged by the European Union and several Western governments as a violation of international law. Narrator VO. Throughout the war, Russia has also used nuclear signaling as a tool of pressure, public statements, snap military exercises, and the deployment of what analysts call dual-capable weapons. Missiles that can be armed with either conventional or nuclear warheads like the Kh-101, the Iskander, and the newer Oreshnik. Analysts are careful to draw a distinction here. The presence of dual-capable systems on the battlefield doesn't mean nuclear weapons themselves have been used. To date, none have. What it does mean is that Russia has used the ambiguity of these systems and periodic nuclear rhetoric from Kremlin officials as a deliberate psychological tool aimed at deterring Western support for Ukraine. Most Western intelligence assessments through 2026 continue to describe actual nuclear use as unlikely, tied specifically to doctrine around existential threats to the Russian state. But the signaling itself has remained a consistent feature of the war. Narrator, VO. Behind every weapon system in this video is the same basic reality. These are strikes on a country still trying to function as a normal society, where people go to work, kids go to school, and families try to keep the lights on, quite literally, in the middle of a war that shows no clear sign of ending. The weapons have changed and evolved, from early war Kalibr and Iskander strikes, to mass drone raids to newer hypersonic and intermediate range systems like the Kinzhal and Oreshnik. But the underlying strategy has remained fairly consistent: overwhelm air defenses, degrade infrastructure, and apply pressure, both military and psychological, for as long as the war continues. Narrator, VO. If you found this breakdown useful, consider subscribing for more in-depth explainers like this one, and let us know in the comments which topic you want covered next.